the Chapter 8 notes, Energy in the Cell. So the first thing I want you to do is to think about what are some things that cells need energy for. What do they use the energy for? So start thinking about all of the functions that the cell does. Getting things in the cell, things that might be going up a concentration gradient, getting things out of cells that might be too large to just go through diffusion, replicating DNA, breaking those hydrogen bonds, making proteins, RNA, all of the functions that the cell has to go through, many of which involve energy. So what do cells use as a source of energy? The molecule that is used is called ATP. It's adenosine triphosphate. In this molecule, the energy is stored within the chemical bonds. This can quickly be used when the bond is broken and easily be used. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It has three parts to it. The first part is adenine. Second part is ribose, the same sugar that's in RNA. And then lastly is a chain of phosphate groups. And if you look on the picture down here, you can see the 1, 2, 3 chains of the phosphate groups. That's where the energy is stored. So the charged phosphate groups in the ATP molecule, they don't necessarily like to be near each other because they're both charged. So making them become near each other and bond together actually requires energy. Energy is taken in for that. And that energy that is taken in to make that happen is stored between those phosphate bonds. So if you ask yourself, well, where does that energy come from? That's where it comes from. So how do we get the energy from our ATP? So if you have a molecule ATP and you want to get some energy from it, first the phosphate group needs to be broken off. It is broken off and removed through a process called hydrolysis. When that happens, I no longer have three ATP, so three phosphate groups. So there, it's no longer a triphosphate; it's a diphosphate group with two. Energy is released from that bond between the two phosphates, and that's the energy that is quickly and easily used in the cell. When bonds are then broken, the energy is released. The cell can use it for whatever function it needs to use it for. Now, ATP is a renewable resource, which means it can be recharged. It's a cycle. So in our picture here, we have our little guy. He's charged up. He has his three phosphates. One phosphate goes away, and he becomes uncharged. So now we have to recharge. So how do we do that? We take in food so that it can be broken down and made into ATP. The ATP-ADP cycle is we start off with our ATP molecule. We have three phosphates together with high energy bonds. One phosphate group is broken off, and that also releases energy at that same time. Then the ADP molecule is produced. Remember, the process that makes that happen is called hydrolysis. Then phosphohydrolysis is when you have a phosphate from another molecule that breaks off and then joins your ADP. Or you can have what's called oxidative phosphorylation, where you have phosphates that are floating freely within the cell, and they join on the ADP and become ATP. So there's two different ways that you can go from ADP to ATP. So now that we know about the energy molecule, let's talk about photosynthesis. This is the starting point. Photosynthesis is the using of sunlight energy to make food or glucose. So all energy in our ecosystem comes from the sun ultimately. So the sun even maintains our homeostasis because it is the sun that allows plants to grow, to store their glucose. We then eat them, and it goes on down the line. So all the energy from our ecosystem eventually can be traced back to the sun. So what happens is the sun energy, the light energy from the sun, is captured by organisms that can make their own food. And remember, we call those autotrophic. They convert that energy into chemical bonds, And they do that by making a molecule called glucose. These autotrophic organisms, like green plants is an example of one of them, uses this process of photosynthesis. So if I had to put a definition on photosynthesis, it would be the process used to change light energy from the sun into chemical bond energy, and that's in the molecule of glucose. So the formula for photosynthesis is I have carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, and it gets made into glucose, oxygen. And you notice the numbers on there. Everything on the left equals everything on the right, because law of conservation of matter says matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred or changed. So how does a plant get the materials that it needs for photosynthesis? So first of all, water, it absorbs it in the roots of the plant. Carbon dioxide it gets through the openings of the leaves called stomata, gets that from the air. And then it gets the light energy. It's absorbed by the chlorophyll, or the green pigment molecules that are in the plants. They absorb the sunlight. So we have a leaf, and in our leaf we have all kinds of different layers, and we're going to look at this in a lab. The bottom right here is a picture of a stomata. That is where the carbon dioxide will get into the leaf. Notice that the leaf is a very complicated system. It's kind of spongy. It has space in between it. It has a cuticle layer on it that keeps water kind of running off of it. And then it has a thicker, spongier layer that goes underneath it. So where does photosynthesis happen? It happens in the chloroplast of the leaves. This is where the chlorophyll is either. And this is the site of photosynthesis. These are organelles that are in plants that can undergo photosynthesis. So if I'm looking at a chloroplast, first the chloroplast is made of what we call a thylakoid membrane. These are sacs in the chloroplast that contain pigments like chlorophyll. And these are like pancake, coin-shaped sacs. Chlorophyll is the green pigment that absorbs light. So what it does is it absorbs green light. Grana makes up chloroplast also. These are the stacks of the thylakoid membrane. So they look like coins stacked on top of each other. The stroma is the fluid of the chloroplast around the grana. So that's how a chloroplast is made. So this is kind of what it looks like. Here we have our stroma, which is in between everything. Our thylakoid membranes are these flat areas, look like coins or pancakes. Those stacks of those are called the grana or granulum. And then we have space in between. We have an inner and outer membrane of our chloroplast. So what are the stages of photosynthesis? First, we have what is called the light-dependent reaction. In the light-dependent reaction, this takes place in the thylakoid membrane, so you need to know that, and it uses the light energy to make molecules that will carry energy. And these molecules that will carry energy are used in the second process. So during the light-dependent reaction that occurs in the thylakoid membrane, the light energy makes molecules that are going to be used in the next process to carry energy. The next process is called the Calvin cycle, also known as the light-independent reaction. This takes place in the stroma of the chloroplast. And this is where the products of the light reaction, those molecules that we talked about, are used to form covalent bonds of carbohydrates. So covalent bonds of carbohydrate occur in the Calvin cycle. They all start with C. And this is we use what is formed in the light reaction for this to happen. So we have light come in, we have our light reaction occur, and then the products from our light reaction in our purple and our red here go into the Calvin cycle, and they produce our sugar, which is our covalent bonds of carbohydrates, and this is where carbon dioxide also comes in. So once our glucose is made, we need to be able to break that down That glucose needs to be broken down into our ATP molecule. So, not all organisms perform photosynthesis. Thus, we have to convert light energy into chemical bond energy. These organisms must obtain their energy from the food they eat. So, we get our food from the energy we eat. We then break down the food to get the energy from that glucose or the chemical bonds that were created by the photosynthetic organisms. So we are going to break that food down. That process is called cellular respiration. So organisms then trap the energy in the bonds of ATP. It is used by the organism to produce small amounts provided by the ATP. And then cellular respiration is the process that does that. It breaks down the food molecules to produce the ATP. And here's our formula for that. We have glucose, oxygen, it creates ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. So where does this happen at? In our eukaryotic cells, it happens in the mitochondria. Both plants and animals possess mitochondria because plants also have to go through this. We have different stages of cellular respiration, and they occur in different areas of the cell, specifically the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is a double membrane organelle. It is made of folds called cristia that increase the surface area of them. The inside portion is the matrix area. So we have lots of room for surface area room here for chemical reactions to occur. So what are the stages of cellular respiration? The first stage is what we call glycolysis. In glycolysis, no oxygen is needed, thus we call it anaerobic. It only makes a little bit of ATP. It occurs in the cytoplasm, and what it does is it takes the glucose and it breaks it down into pyruvic acid and electron carriers, which will be important later. The second part is a Krebs cycle, and this is the part that requires oxygen. It only makes a little bit of ATP. It occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria, and it uses the pyruvic acid from the Krebs cycle, from glycolysis to make more electron carriers. Then the third part. This is where we get lots of ATPs, and it uses all those electron carriers that are used in glycolysis and the second phase. This occurs in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and it does require oxygen. So this is where those carriers are going to move those electrons down the chain to produce ATP as it goes along, and it makes a lot of ATP. So here's the stages. We have glycolysis, no oxygen needed, it makes pyruvic acid. And then it goes into the Krebs cycle, where it makes both of these first two make a little bit of ATP. And then the products from these go into the electron transport chain, and oxidative phosphorylation makes lots of ATPs. Remember, oxidative phosphorylation is the process where the phosphates are put onto the ADP, or the phosphates are hooked into phosphates that are floating around the cell, are then hooked onto molecules. So why is the used energy released from the bonds instead of going through the trouble of making ATP? Organisms use energy in small amounts and at certain times. So if it broke apart a glucose molecule every time they needed it, most of the energy would be wasted. So it's not efficient to do it that way. So we break it down into these molecules of ATP that can be used quickly and efficiently. So what if oxygen is not present? Well, remember that glycolysis is anaerobic, the very first step. So we can do that and you get a small amount of ATP. But after that, some other processes will be needed to produce the ATP. There are two types of fermentation that can occur. First is lactic acid fermentation, and the byproduct of that is lactic acid. It can build up your muscles, and it can make your muscles sore, and it produces ATP. We also have alcoholic fermentation. It produces CO2, alcohol, and ATP. This is the thing that's produced by yeast and some bacteria and is used to make lots of foods and drinks and things like that. So this is the process there. The glucose goes in, that pyruvate is broken down into that. It can either go into the mitochondria and then go into the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, etc., to make it, or it can go into fermentation, anaerobic without oxygen, and either do alcoholic or lactic acid fermentation. Those are the routes that can be taken with glucose. So that is our notes. It wraps it up on chapter 8.